today I wanted to share some key messaging from an intellectual piece of work that I began during a 3-year tenure at the Center for Development Research in Bonn. And this was whilst working on the Crossroads Asia project, which was a project that was interested in rethinking area studies, especially in this age where we have much more mobility than before. This is work that I'm still in the process of writing, and it is work that has relevance for notions of decolonizing urbanism, even though its focus is not on urban issues per se. More specifically, as a result of this desk-bound work I've been engaged in, I call for an unthinking of science as we currently know and live it, especially within what Ramon Grossvogel calls our Westernized universities. This call is firmly, I would say, is firmly situated within the many current academic debates that recognize the need for renewed approaches to scientific research. That is, approaches that are multiple, intersectional, transgressive, and potentially even open-ended. It is in a bid to join these many quests for change that I will highlight the importance of Rethinking Science by pointing to why we need to do so, and to, by in some ways humbly providing some ideas on how we might be able to do so. And this I do by turning to a range of concepts and approaches that include notions of decolonial loving and becoming. In the process of making my arguments today, I will touch on a rather eclectic figuration of literature, and this is really part of what I think of as, in my case, it was a post-disciplinary but desk-bound study, and it was really, in some ways, perhaps also a review of literature without borders. Many of the authors took me on numerous lines of rhizomatic flight by providing a various array of ideas and in some ways you can think of it as differing diagnostics on the multiple facets of this complex, dynamic, and epigenetically entangled world that we live in. Through these authors, I highlight the ways in which we need to change how we think and what we do in order to be expansive in preparing for our futures and for a broader comprehension of the many realities and inequalities in the present, many of which are inheritances of rather unsavory pasts for which we also need to make some kind of social and cognitive amends. Okay. Now, there are many reasons for promoting what I describe as an unthinking of science, some of which are related to technical and pragmatic ideas around how to do better research, and others which are substantially political in their intent. But the first argument I shall present is around the question of mobility and the uneven geographies of the globe. More specifically, we witness the many unexpected results of increasing mobility of people, goods, capital, and ideas. And it is this fluidity that no longer justifies a division of the world in territorially fixed areas defined by certain predictable character traits. This is why Wilhelm van Schendel called for a move from trait geographies to process geographies. And van Schendel, as some of you might know, is a professor of modern Asian history. It has also been one of the rethinking challenges for area studies scholars in particular, as they've sought to develop concepts of area that take these dynamisms, new interdependencies, and spatial formations into account. It is also the ubiquity of people's movement around the globe that has galvanized continental philosopher Thomas Nail to raise questions which center the figure of the migrant as a political icon of our time. That is, one who begs us to reconsider the absurd notion that mobility is a contemporary aberration, when in fact it is rather recent imagining of nation states that have served as the disruptive latecomer to the ever-increasing mobile reality of humanity since the first curious Africans left the continent and populated the world. It is this historical movement and the increasing complexity of our global environments that demand innovative forms of knowledge production about the dynamic human and non-human interactions processes that can only be barely understood through multiple disciplinary perspectives, as well as perhaps through a reflection on the positionality of the researcher in these processes. And these are both ideas that I will discuss a little bit more in depth. Furthermore, in many parts of the world nowadays, we witness the multiple effects of global capitalism in increased flows, that is fluid, epigenetically entangled networks of people, fauna, flora, places, ideas, things, and so forth. But also at the same time, the differential and at times uneven spatial development that ensues. And within this dynamism, social concerns and struggles around economic, ecological, and other challenges are ensnared within contentious politics, cultural becomings, spiritual beliefs, dynamic multidimensional social spatialities, and continuous contestations over geography, resources, and knowledge. And all of these are also interwoven in and through our very, I would say, complex and indeterminate times. What I've just described could also be argued to be the makings of a certain crisis of capitalism that Marxist geographer and anthropologist David Harvey eloquently speaks of. And there's an interesting, for those who want a shortcut, RSA animates video where he talks a little bit about his book. That is the many failures of an unchecked neoliberal economic system that cannot suffice or even account for the multiple lived realities around the globe. In the same somewhat contradictory breath, capitalism is also said to bear the burden, if even only by implication, for the many social struggles that I mentioned around the globe, particularly over geography, resources, and knowledge. This is especially felt to be true for those who find themselves on the peripheries of transmodernity and its multiple fluidities. That is, people with no place within the many monetary power plays and pinnacles of a globalizing world where transnational corporations are worth more than clusters of countries, and the gap between the filthy rich, the 1%, and everyone else continues to widen exponentially. From another perspective, from the field of future studies, Ziauddin Sadar tells us that these are certainly post-normal times, in which we are subject to the 3 C's, chaos, complexity, and contradiction, which is not only challenge the very notion of life as we assume it to be, but also how we imagine our common futures, including how we as researchers conduct the scientific research that informs it all. In other words, we live in a multifaceted, dynamic, ambiguous, and uncertain world that makes certain linear modes of thought, such as ideas of modernity, progress, and development, null and void. It is for this reason that Ryle Miller talks of the need for making uncertainty a core analytical aspect of a better thinking about the future, and thus too of the present. In particular, he advocates that within scientific inquiry, we should strive to use a free anticipatory approach, the emerging discipline of anticipation, or futures literacy, which can help reduce the fear of the unknown and is a more systematic and accurate way of using the future to understand the present. Similarly, Sadar and John Sweeney ask us to make uncertainty central to research, as it is often not catered for in most kinds of analysis in the social sciences. More specifically, they propose a new method for foresight and future researchers and practitioners, for which they outline the 3 tomorrows of post-normal times. In this, Sadar and Sweeney define the future as being comprised of 1, the surface uncertainty of an extended present that has largely already been colonized. So, for example, the idea that this talk will go on for an hour and there will be a discussion afterwards. But 2, the shallow uncertainty of familiar futures, which are mediated by existing imaginings of the future. And this you can look at knowing that there's an academic year and what courses it will take during this year and what other events that might occur in this year. But of course, always with uncertainty underlining these certainties. And third, the deep uncertainty of unthought futures. In light of this understanding of what constitutes as the future, they argue that only collaborative creativity and ethical imagination can be used as tools to help us construct scenarios for this interactive terrain, which is mediated by pure possibility and the many unknown unknowns. And of course, some of us might remember that term as being a term that Donald Rumsfeld used before the war on terror. Additionally, Manuel Lima, a specialist on data visualization, among other things, says that we are confronted with a new challenge in our mapping of an increasing complex world, which is epitomized by the power of networks. More specifically, he argues that we must face and embrace a paradigm shift away from our use of the tree metaphor, which has primarily served to order, simplify, and unify life, in that this metaphor may have been useful in the 17th to 19th century for comprehending problems of simplicity, but it fails to have utility in understanding the organized complexity of the late 20th century and beyond. Instead of tree metaphors, we need to grapple with non-hierarchical, decentered, and non-signifying concepts such as rhizomes or networks for determining and deciphering the complexities of various ecosystems. For example, Lima argues that societies are networks of people, whose brains are networks of neurocells, which are also in turn networks of molecules, and so on. Additionally, networks also pervade human technology, the internet, transportation systems, power grids, and I think we also in some ways learned about the grids underneath in terms of the water. I'm thinking of the water presentation we had earlier this week. Indeed, Lima says that these key concepts apply to the mapping of multiple areas of knowledge, be that the small-scale neural network of a mouse or the grand-scale millennium simulation of the growth of cosmic structure and the formation of galaxies. This is why Lima talks about how Wikipedia, as one of the largest rhizomatic structures created by humankind, demonstrates the highly interconnected and networked nature of knowledge, which is in direct contrast to the linear tree-like account or classification of knowledge by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent D'Alembert in their French encyclopedia. The same contrast can be found in how we currently understand nature to be a web of life that is diverse and epigenetically entangled species, all tied together by a vast network of bacteria, as opposed to being disparate and hierarchically organized discrete life forms seated neatly upon Charles Darwin's tree of life. And I can assure you that right now I really have this sense of being, this idea of networks of bacteria, of which 90%, a human body is comprised 90% of bacteria. And at this moment, I do really have this sense of being entangled with something that is not myself, very strongly. But it is for all these reasons that we need a revised way of thinking, the paradigm shift, and perhaps even a return to polymathic ways of knowledge making. For Lima, this new mode of thinking would be a mental shift towards network thinking, which is basically about innovative partnerships, shared ethical and moral principles, and collective intelligence. And for me, what is striking is, for many of these scholars, this notion of imagination, creativity, partnerships, and ethics and morals seems to be a strong point. Another important reason for unthinking, I would say, is about the stories we have been told, especially the stereotypes, the misrepresentations, and so forth. And I'll leave it to this short video to make my next point.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through the refining fire of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works, not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justified through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves, the exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype. Decode the fiction. Unlearn the myth.
Yeah, an interesting and short video. And I think for me, the other thing I find interesting within this is the invisible story that's not been told. So the story of the narrator, really, that is also absent in this story that's been told. But the other thing I would say for me that's important is this, in relation to this idea of storytelling, is that researchers as well themselves are storytellers, and one could argue perhaps the most dangerous kind of storytellers, because often what we write is assumed to be the truth. And this is why, in some ways, decolonialists also argue that in our globalizing world, we can be certain that there are many ways of being, that many ways of being were, have been, and still are being threatened, alongside ways of knowing. In fact, knowledge as a key ideological and economic frontier is a battlefield where Western, or more precisely, Euro-North American thought, albeit provincial, is universalized through the exploitation of gendered, racialized, and heteronormative relations of capitalist production, which are imbued in certain academic knowledge regimes, internationalized education systems, neoliberal economic and governance models, modern lifestyles informed by global popular cultures, and other forms of what Anibal Quijano will call coloniality of power. And these inadvertently, and in certain instances intentionally, destroy numerous ontologies and related world senses in their wake. Decolonial thought also speaks to indigenous knowledge movements that argue for an understanding and recognition of other ways of knowing and sensing the world. That is, ways that are perhaps non-binary, this idea of theory versus practice, culture versus nature, ways that are non-proprietary, collective or communal, dynamic, relational, and also seek to ensure the sovereignty and self-determination of peoples. These scholars and activists also call for a holistic view on knowledge that not only takes the spiritual, developmental, and political into account, but also recognizes the interconnected ecological relationships amongst humans, that is the living, ancestors, and the unborn, as well as other species and the environment. It is in light of these arguments that Ramon Grossfogel asks us whether we can produce knowledges that go beyond both Eurocentric and third world fundamentalisms. Both he and other decolonial scholars speak of the need to end the epistemic violence embodied by mainstream academic scholarship. Collectively, as well as individually, they argue for conscious objections to what Grossfogel describes as the epistemic racism or sexism that is foundational to the knowledge structures of Westernized universities that are implicated in the extermination of other knowledges and ways of being. And I think here it's important for me to note for those who might not be aware that Grossfogel specifically uses Westernized and not Western to really talk about these systems of knowledge that have dispersed across the globe and are being reproduced in many different locations around the globe. These decolonial scholars, as well as scholars such as Sabelu Ndlovu-Gatsheni and Molefe Keya-Santik, critique the tyranny of abstract universals and the persistence of Euro-North American intellectual thought in academic and everyday imaginaries around the globe. They also call for a reconstitution of knowledges on other world senses and views in order to de-link from Westernized knowledge production processes that basically serve as an essential component of the ongoing maintenance of a colonial matrix of power. And in many ways, I had mentioned at the beginning how some are interested in rethinking of science for more technical or pragmatic reasons, but others for more political. And this is really the point that's being made up here. So it's not just questioning the terms, not just questioning the knowledge, but questioning the actual terms of what we see as valid knowledge. It is for the reasons just mentioned that certain critical epistemological questions have been raised. For example, the one by Grossvogel when he asked, how is it possible that the canon of thought in all the disciplines of the social sciences and humanities in the Westernized university is based on the knowledge produced by a few men from 5 countries in Western Europe, Italy, France, England, Germany, and the USA. The same might be said about the sources of knowledge for other disciplines within the Westernized universities, so the hard sciences and so on. Consequently, there is an urgent need to rethink knowledge production, especially in light of this and other challenges faced within higher education specifically. That is, issues to do with binaries, boundaries, and hierarchies of knowledge, for example. More specifically, we find ourselves, especially in this material moment, whereby knowledge has become an economized industry within which universities continue to be co-opted by neoliberal illogics, thus are corporatized as they compete for global rankings based on narrow categorizations of what is valid knowledge for living in an ever-expanding and overburdened universe. While scholars vie for limited resources and a handful of tenured positions in an employment market epitomized by precarity and laced with the illusion of scientific objectivity or detached neutral points of observation. Even more disturbingly, knowledge from specific Euro-North American locations is still being universalized as it attempts to displace other knowledges, ways of seeing and sensing, that are actively ignored or marginalized. This is why for sociologist and legal scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos, any process of untraining our intellectual selves must include an acknowledgement of the autonomous and enabling diversity in the world. So in a form of conclusion about the why we need to unthink, we as knowledge producers are significantly implicated in neoliberal imaginaries. And by this I refer to privatization, patenting, and commodification efforts around knowledge. And also to the concomitant process for knowledge and its production, for our development within a rather linear and binary narrative of growth and civilizational progress. This is why, for us, the investigation and comprehension of the politics of the who, where, what, why, and how of scholarship are critical and foundational concerns for doing what I describe as an unthinking of science. My use of unthinking versus rethinking is purposeful because I use the term to stress the need for us to move beyond scientific approaches mired in a language of hierarchical Cartesian binaries, where false dichotomies are constructed between minds and bodies, culture and nature, theory and practice, physical and metaphysical, men and women, self and other, and so on ad infinitum. Instead, we require transgressive practices that enable us to attempt to gain understandings, albeit partial ones, of contemporary, chaotic, complex, and contradictory phenomena through knowledge production processes that are not reductionist, exclusionary, elitist, and/or privileging of only Western modes of seeing versus sensing the world. And at this point, I am very aware of the irony of me making this argument from a sort of very logocentric position and mode of presenting this knowledge. With this, I argue for the decolonization of our current modes of knowledge production within academia. More specifically, I propose that we seek ways to become reflexive and embodied agents for social and cognitive justice within our institutions, communities, societies, and the world at large. This becoming of ours needs to include the identification of radical and critical pedagogies, which enable us to teach ourselves and others how to transgress established knowledge boundaries, as well as how to move beyond Cartesian thinking that privileges the mind over the body, theory over practice, the text over context, and so on. We should do this by inhabiting the ambiguous and at times frustrating interstices of such false hierarchical binaries with all of our bodies, minds, hearts, and souls. We must find a way to link our multiple and intersectional selves into our work, leaving nothing by the wayside, especially not the spiritual and quirky aspects of our identities. In my case, an obvious love for cartoons. If we are aware that reality is socially constructed and that much of our everyday is about performativity, then why do we see fit to unquestionably section out so-called non-academic parts of ourselves, emotion, artistry, activism, or spirituality, from our objective work processes? We need to learn to think with more than only our minds, but also too with our hearts, as after all, these cells too have memory. And there's an interesting book by, I think it's Paul Purcell, that called The Heart Code, that looks at how the heart has memory and is really in relation to heart transplantation research, and how through some of those processes people actually change in terms of their personalities. We must consider and experience knowledges that are not only read through the textual, but also heard through ears, smelt with the nose, tasted by the tongue and the skin, intuited in our bones, and sensed on both physical and metaphysical planes. This is what I consider as unthinking, a wallowing, and perhaps for some even a drowning, in changeable seas of knowledge impossibilities that are at times fresh and soothing in their familiarity, but often salty, rough, and terrifying in their chaotic inundations and their wrenching of us through certain unknown conceptions of existence. Now I want to continue to perhaps elaborate a bit more on how we might be able to attempt an unthinking of science. And I do so by referring to the experimentation of others, and some of this work is not new. And some of this work also may not have borne fruit as yet. But I would say that the most obvious recommendation in light of the many whys for unthinking science is that we need to start by recognizing that a dynamic and complex world such as the one we live in, it requires us to use inter, multi, cross, trans, and even post-disciplinary approaches to science. But in my view, post-disciplinarity is of the greatest interest. And maybe this might also be linked to my own trajectory in terms of being within architecture in some ways, which is post-disciplinary as a discipline, and also linked to my own interest in many different kinds of knowledges. Okay. Post-disciplinary approaches already exist and can be found amongst mobility studies, cultural studies, or feminist studies, to name a few. But as far as Andrew Sayer, a sociologist, is concerned, within the field of sociology, post-disciplinarity is a welcome change due to the parochial and often imperialistic character of the disciplines. For Sayer, and I quote, post-disciplinary studies emerge when scholars forget about disciplines and whether ideas can be identified with any particular one. They identify with learning rather than disciplines. Similarly, Julie Buckler, a professor of Slavic languages and literature and Slavic languages and literatures and comparative literature, she argues that post-disciplinarity, and I quote again, evokes an intellectual universe in which we inhabit the ruins of outmoded disciplinary structures, mediating between our nostalgia for this lost unity and our excitement at the intellectual freedom its demise can offer us. Post-disciplinarity would also serve to rupture what Afrikaner philosopher Louis Gordon calls the disciplinary decadence of our times, whereby he states, and I quote again, instead of being open-ended pursuits of knowledge, many disciplines have become self-circumscribed in their aims and methods in ways that appear ontological. By this I mean that many disciplines lose sight of themselves as efforts to understand the world and have collapsed into the hubris of asserting themselves as the world. In some ways, engaging in post-disciplinarity begins to speak to Mignolo's notion of delinking, where we refuse to reify some knowledges above others and instead creatively engage in the formulation of novel approaches, perspectives, and theorizations that are situated in the borderlands, the interstices, and I can never say that word properly, or in-betweens of differential and differentiated epistemologies and ontologies. Such a delinking is also very much a part of the decolonizing project, such as that of Grossvogel for decolonizing of the Westernized university. And he suggests that we can do this by first acknowledging the provincialism and epistemic racism or sexism of the foundational epistemic structures resulting from 4 epistemicides or genocides. And for him, these 4 genocides are: 1, the Spanish conquest of Muslims and Jews in Al-Andalus in the 15th century; 2, the discovery or the conquest of the Americas after Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492; 3, the kidnapping and enslaving of millions of Africans for over 400 years. In other words, the transatlantic slave trade. And the 4th connection, which for me was interesting because I would not necessarily have put these events together, is the branding of Indo-European women as witches, and this being due, he argues, to their leadership and authority and their vast indigenous knowledge, and this being in the 16th century. Another piece of advice he gives in relation to decolonizing the Westernized universities, he said we need to really break away from universalisms, where Euro-North American knowledge, and especially the canon, is assumed to be universal. And by doing so, then coming into this notion of epistemic diversity and bringing this into the canon of thought, and in some ways then creating a pluriverse of meaning and concepts. And this including having certain kinds of inter-epistemic conversations that then produce, hopefully, redefinitions of old concepts, and also contribute to the reconstitution of knowledges on other world senses and views. Now, in my mind, any decolonizing project also requires forms of critical literacy, borrowing this term coined by the educationalist Paulo Freire. As far as critical theorist and also educationalist Douglas Kellner is concerned, there are multiple critical literacies required, especially for the field of education, and especially in a globalizing world. And for him, those critical literacies are print literacy, computer literacy, multimedia literacy, media literacy, social literacy, cultural literacy, and eco-literacy. And to this list, I will also add the importance of enabling critical spatial literacy, which I describe as the development of a critical understanding of the politics of space that is determining and documenting what kinds of social insights are encoded in the built environment, how the built form may reproduce and/or contest dominant ideologies, and how in the latter case, these contestations require an ability to critically read the world. And I will take this lecture hall as an example, where as a lecture hall, it's not simply, in reading this room, it's not simply about the materiality of this room, the chairs, the tables, the projector, the mics that have been packed with here, but it's also about the practice and me speaking to you, you listening to me, and the ideologies behind what it means to be in a lecture room and how those ideologies in this room predispose us to this particular kind of practice and not something else. Basically, a critical literacy on space is a critical awareness of the historical, geographical, economic, cultural, and political meanings that inform and are informed by the built environment and its constructs, both physical and ideological. In this vein, I believe that we must develop several kinds of strategies for reading the word and world, or text and context. That is, developing reading techniques that go far beyond the above general reading strategies that we would often learn about in primary school. For as Paulo Freire reminds us, reading is not exhausted merely by decoding the written word or written language, but rather anticipated by and extending into knowledge of the world. Reading the world precedes reading the word, and the subsequent reading of the word cannot dispense with continually reading the world. Language and reality are dynamically intertwined. The understanding attained by critical reading of a text implies perceiving the relationship between the text and context. In a similar vein, we also need to critically rewrite the word and world. For as Linda Tuwai Smith, a scholar of indigenous education, says, and I quote, "Writing can also be dangerous because we reinforce and maintain the style of discourse which is never innocent." This danger is magnified for her in particular because, as she says, and I'm quoting again, "When I read texts, for example, I frequently have to orient myself to a text world in which the center of academic knowledge is either in Britain, the United States, or Western Europe, in which words such as we, us, our, I actually exclude me." In talking about writing here, I do not want to privilege only the written text as the way of knowing and being, because this is really would be problematic in light of the many modes of writing that abound, especially those that invoke the use of the body and those that are instant in nature. Now, aside from developing critical literacy, there's also, I would say, the importance of understanding that all knowledge is situated, in that knowledge is produced in specific circumstances, and that those circumstances shape it in some way. Consequently, we shouldn't and couldn't pretend to be all-seeing and all-knowing scientists. For feminist geographer Gillian Rose, reflexivity becomes a key strategy for situating knowledges because it avoids a false neutrality and universality of academic knowledge. It follows then that engaging with positionality at all scales also matters for unthinking science, as well as for situating knowledges. Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies, Elizabeth Chiseri-Strater, argues that researchers are positioned by age, gender, race, class, nationality, sexuality, institutional affiliation, intellectual predisposition, education history, and other aspects of their personal circumstances and experiences that in turn mediate their very production of knowledge. And yet within academia for a very long time, positionality had been like the proverbial elephant in the room, ever present but treated as invisible in the face of rather problematic positivistic notions to do with neutrality, objectivity, and universality of knowledge. This is why feminist scholar Donna Haraway, who is also Professor Emerita in the history of consciousness, argues that for politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situating, for making knowledge or truth claims. Basically, I would say that we must move towards radicalizing our various approaches to scientific inquiry. And for this, I would say there are already many different radical approaches to decolonize or transform our research practices towards making what feminist educator Anna Louise Keating calls threshold theories. Now, some of these approaches, I might argue, is about being post-disciplinary scholars in our use of perspective, concepts, and methodologies, and engaging in what has been termed as border thinking, working with the in-betweens, where, for example, canon meets the field, where theory meets practice, and so on. But I would also argue that it's also perhaps also in doing scholarship for social justice. That is, research being a practice that is very much about an interplay between reflection and action, knowing and doing, research and practice. And here I'm using the term praxis that Paola Freire highlighted, especially for educationalists. But I'll also say it's also perhaps moving into and thinking of certain normative modes of science. And this, many scholars are engaged in now and have been for a while, but these are scholars that are interested in slow scholarship, in more embodied scholarship, in contemplative scholarship, in scholarship that is about collective work, in bringing spirituality into scholarship, in non-Western scholarships or knowledges, and or indigenous knowledges. But also perhaps, and even those who are interested in this idea of an academics of the heart, or Ethnographic Refusal. And these two I'll talk about a little bit more. So Professor of Higher Education, Laura Rendon, argues that although we are charged with the above sacred task, many of us are unable to adequately do so because we sit under a fog of modern consciousness that has been inherited from Descartes and his followers. This, namely, is enshrined in two ideas. One, that we gain understanding solely through intellectual training and analysis, and two, that reason and emotion are separate and irreconcilable. For Rendon, this challenge can be overcome by enabling what she described as an academics of the heart, made up of three elements that need to be incorporated into research design, analysis, and discussion of findings. One, viewing research as a relationship-centered process in which the knower and what is to be known exist in relationship to each other, and both the heart, artistry of spirit, as she also describes it as, and science are honored in the research process. And this, I would say, this relationship of the knower and the known is talked about in detail in quite a bit in the Anders Berman article that was, I think is on the list, with places to think with, places to think with, books to think about. But second point that element that she has is that really there needs to be an honoring of diverse ways of knowing, because the truth comes in many forms and from a vast array of realities. The third element for Rendon is that we need to engage in contemplative practice, self-reflection and introspection while connecting the inner and outer nature of knowledge, that is ourselves, to the external world. Now, Rendon turns to the ancient wisdom of the indigenous people of Mexico and Central America to frame the philosophical foundation of the research dimensions of academics of the heart. So from the Mayas, she takes the principle of the unity of existence, and also the connection of opposite principles. And finally, the idea that to know is to understand how something fits in a changing, expanding world system. Additionally, she states that Mayas saw science and divination as being inseparable. Also from the Aztecs, she takes the idea of the importance of employing the heart in the search for individual growth and universal truth. Rendon's position aligns with social innovator and educator Dustin Cron's call to recenter human consciousness from the mind to the heart. That is shifting from what he calls a mind-centered egolatry of colonial modernity to Islam's epistemic decolonization through the heart. More specifically, Crown describes how in Sufi Islamic thought, the human being is created by God and is made up of 5 parts: the body, jism, mind, akal, spirit, ruh, the self, nafs, and heart, qalb. The latter of which is considered to be a spiritual organ that is central to existence and the human being's relationship to God. In this argument for the heart in human consciousness, Crown speaks not only about reunifying anthropos, other, to humanitas, self, but also of the relevance of a decolonial love, a concept that has been developed by Chicana feminists. And this as a way of recentering the sacred into science by using love to help us move towards global understanding and decoloniality. For example, he speaks of Chicano or Latino studies scholar Laura Perez and her interest in the Mayan principle of in la quech, which in Spanish is tú eres mi otro yo, or in English, you are my other me. Now here, I must also refer to post-colonial feminist and Chicana studies scholar Chela Sandoval, who also speaks to this notion of decolonial love, as she lays out a method for emancipation that she terms as a methodology of the oppressed. More specifically, in her book of the same name, she provides us with the primary inner and outer technologies that construct and enable a differential mode of social movement and consciousness made out of different theories on semiotics, deconstruction, meta-idealizing, differential movement, and democratics. Additionally, she provides us with forms of this dissident consciousness in discussions about the principles of political love and desire, using love as a political apparatus, moving towards an end of academic apartheid, the basis for creating interdisciplinary knowledge, radical mestiçage, difference, the grammatical position of subjugation, the middle voice as the third voice, technoscience politics, and decolonizing cyberspace. And again, moving to Anders Berman, he also gives us an account of Aymara epistemology, where there's a discussion about the different ways of thinking, and one being through the heart. And also, what I found interesting in that article as well was these different modes of talking. So, for example, the way I've been presenting scholars would be considered to be a lie, because I actually do not know these scholars, and yet I present their work as if I do. Yeah. I would say that of equal importance is the work of feminist, queer, and Chicana scholar Gloria Anzaldúa on borderlands and border consciousness, of which she put forward the latter as a strategy to enable her own spiritual activism. For Anzaldúa, borderlands can be found in physical geography, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, gender, language, and psychological frames of mind, all of which must always be crossed as a kind of reconstitution of the oppressive, hegemonic, and patriarchal conceptions and realities of those said borders, but also as a reconceptualization of the boundaries of life. This she does by embodying, or this she did, I should rather say, by embodying a practice of border consciousness, the new mestiçage, which comes as a result of her own, what was her own grappling with an ambiguous multiple identity and positionality situated and resisting at the interface of the Mexican-American border. For Anzaldúa, borderlands is a liminal space, that is a space of possibility. And I would read this, but with the English translation for those who might need it. Because I, a mestiçaje, continually walk out of one culture and into another, because I'm in all cultures at the same time. So between two worlds, 3, 4, my head buzzes with the contradictory. I'm guided by all voices that speak to me simultaneously. Additionally, decolonial scholars Walter Mignolio and Marina Slotsanova argue that borders are not only geographic but also epistemic. This is why they both call for a shifting of the geo and body politics of knowledge, which means that it's not only physical borders that need to be contested, but also knowledge borders. And this is because the territorial and imperial, because there is a territorial and imperial modern foundation of knowledge. Now, beyond contesting knowledge, of interest to Unthinking Science will also be a decolonizing of methodologies. And there are many lessons to learn, for example, from the work on indigenous methodologies by indigenous education scholar Linda Tui Smith, or anthropologist and philosopher Rodolfo Kusch, and indigenous knowledge scholar and educationalist Margaret Kovac, just to name a few. But even more importantly, I would say we should also consider refusal to collect and or disseminate research findings as an important approach to unthinking research practice. For example, Alexander Zahara, a doctoral student in geography with a focus on discard studies, presents us with ethnographic refusal. And this is seen as, and I quote, a practice by which researchers and research participants together decide not to make particular information available for use within the academy. Its purpose is not to bury information, but to ensure that communities are able to respond to issues on their own terms. An ethnographic refusal is intended to redirect academic analysis away from harmful pain-based narratives that obscure slow violence and towards the structures and institutions that engender those narratives. And this above image So this above image is a photo that was on a Facebook page of the Stop the Dump group. Stop the Dump fires in the Arctic community of, and I cannot pronounce it, but Iqaluit in Nunavut. And it features a pregnant Inuk woman, which is also an activist, and it was taken during a 4-month-long dump fire that occurred during the summer of 2014. And during this fire, pregnant women and women of childbearing age were warned not to go outside because of the risk caused by dioxins. And the text, or the Inuk Titut syllabics written on a hand, read the word timer or enough. And this is referring to decades of government underfunding that contributed to this dump. Finally, I would say that we should engage in certain radical pedagogies for teaching students and ourselves how to transgress knowledge boundaries. That is, ideas imbued in educational philosophies such as critical pedagogy, anarchist geographies, as well as other critical modes of instructional praxis. Critical pedagogy, for example, is designed to serve the purpose of both empowering educators and teaching for empowerment. In that, one, it asks what is the relationship between what educators do in the classroom and efforts to build a better society. Two, it encourages educators to seek connections that will link their personal brand of pedagogy to wider social processes, structures, and issues. And three, it provides educators with the critical skills, conceptual means, and moral imperatives to analyze critically the goals of schooling. Critical pedagogy, accordingly, involves a strong agenda for change within education, through education, and throughout society. And I would say this should also be the case for any kind of critical unthinking of the sciences. Critical pedagogy, for example, is why Paulo Freire states one of the most important tasks of critical educational practice is to make possible the conditions in which the learners, in their interactions with one another and with their teachers, engage in the experience of assuming themselves as social, historical, thinking, communicating, transformative, creative persons, dreamers of possible utopias, capable of being angry because of a capacity to love. So ultimately, for me, an important aspect to any unthinking is that of unlearning all that we have been socialized into. This starts by not taking any of the processes that we know for granted. It is also done, I would say, by engaging in perhaps in postdisciplinarity, as I mentioned earlier, as well as through the decolonizing of methodologies. Of significance in these endeavors, I would say, are also a conscious awareness of positionalities and a bid to ideally co-construct with our peers or with other researchers, but also with others outside of academia, threshold theories. And I believe these are essential aspects of a researcher's open-ended becoming, and for better contestation of power knowledge regimes that reify and universalize context-specific ontologies, cosmologies, ecologies, epistemologies, philosophies on existence, and so on. For after all, learning is not something that happens in parentheses, something that you bookend between your head, four walls, a class period, a school year, or some momentary academic career. Learning is unlearning. It's living and non-living. It's becoming and unbecoming. It's believing and disbelieving. It's ambiguous and unambiguous. It's pronounceable and unpronounceable. And it's as open-ended as my thoughts flying off this page into your amorphous existence. And there.
Dr. Epifania, many thanks for such enlightening thoughts. Since she shared with us some thoughts on thinking science, I think at this juncture it's only appropriate that we also obtain some questions for her. So if there are any questions, please the floor is open.
Or comments? Or
Okay.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful lecture, and also for pushing us to also this model lecture space that we actually frequent and inhabit. I was wondering, how do you, of course, on the level of like teaching, on the level of how we think maybe the immediate practice, we are doing maybe, or some of us are doing this kind of work, or trying in a way to do this work. The institution itself, you mentioned it, at the beginning, it's a corporate institution, and depending where you are, the kind of academic capitalism is very, very strong, the kind of pressure, precarity, the kind of requirements that are being asked in order to enter the institution are getting higher and higher.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you negotiate these two? Because on the one side we do have projects that go outside this kind of space, that create, I don't know, autonomous universities or nomadic university or other ways of thinking, collective knowledge production and reflection. So how do you see this kind of tension between the institution and the practice of revolutionary, or also the refusal to be part of this kind of commodification?
Well, I guess in my mind, I think it boils down in some ways to how can I put it? Not individual. I don't want to call it individual consciousness, but in terms of the risk, the risks involved are born individually. So then it comes down to individual choice and what matters for that individual and what they want to be able to do and how they want to be able to teach or not teach. And I actually think that for some it means sometimes certain kinds of compromises, and for others it means not staying within the academy. And I also feel that in some ways that our abilities to deal with those situations are dependent on the circumstances and determining. Well, I think of this notion of the war versus the battle, right? So determining whether at this moment it is worth pushing for a particular thing to happen in that moment, as opposed to letting it go because there is a bigger project, which might be the educating of the students. But the way I see it, I think it varies from people, from person to person. It varies from institution to institution. In some cases, I would say individual scholars create certain kinds of support systems within their institution. Of course, it also differs for those who have tenure and those who don't. And so I would say that I think those tensions are definitely there, but how you react to them really depends on what you as a person, and actually not, I should say not as a person, because often people also have their families as well, but what you're willing to risk in your life, yeah. But when you asked me the question, it reminded me of, there was an education talk, and this Professor Donald Macedo talked about the need to always have one foot in academia and the other foot outside, and how this helps, well, not only to ground you, but perhaps it also enables you to have more than one possibility.
Yes, madam.
Thank you for this great talk, and I really like that you put Gloria Amoo-Adare at the front of the modern thinking, because that is sometimes we find problematic that Gloria Amoo-Adare's work disappears, so I would appreciate that. I was just thinking about actually the moment of discomfort. I mean, talking about epistemic racism in these halls and these houses is provoking a lot of discomfort.
Yes.
annoyed. They react like they feel provoked. So I'm just because I have all these moments, and so what to do about these moments?
This is a really good question. I mean, in some ways, I don't think I have the answer because in many ways, I'm still trying to find it myself. In some ways, I think at the moment for me, I've been trying to see it through, like I remember talking with a colleague, and this wasn't even academia, this is in the NGO world, because I think that some of the issues are also there. But talking to colleagues about thinking for myself how this notion of divine love, of being love, how to be able to embody that, how to be that in your everyday existence. And I actually feel that in some ways it's in trying to take this on and having this in your own interactions that perhaps creates the spaces where you may be able to create certain kinds of dialogues or conversations about some of the hard questions. But I don't think this is always the case. And for me, the other challenge sometimes is I think in our session we had a discussion about making space. But how do you make the space to be able to have these kinds of conversations? And especially with those who might not see it, don't understand it, and don't even know why you think there's a problem. And I don't know if this has been resolved as yet. But at the same time, I was thinking of this idea that I think is Anna Louise Keating talks about, trying to move towards post-oppositional politics. Because I also understand sometimes the need for direct confrontation, but I don't always believe that in some ways that this is the answer, because in certain ways you end up with losers, and you have to you have to continue living with the losers. And what does this mean? How does this work in certain ways? And this is why I wonder about how this notion of love might be useful in moving, finding a way to move together to something that's different.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to jump on the question of racism, but I want to monetize it a little bit because of, I think, racism nowadays, because he says we are living in a more globalized world, and I think the concepts also are somehow globalized, and they are not totally aware that we say racism when during the colonial times not the same thing today. And at the moment I can assert there is no racism. And talking about racism is for me reducing a lot of complexities, a lot of problems, other problems behind this concept. Because people have other problems when they're behaving one way or in another way. Trying to look for that problems, I think it can help both sides, the victims as well as those who are doing it, to come in some way together. Because personally, let me say like this, I don't reduce myself on this, but I know that behind this there is something. And rethinking about education, rethinking about disciplines, I think it's also good to rethink about racism in the way we are using it, because I think it's sometimes instrumentalized by some people just to attain some objective. That's one thought. But I do very much like your concepts of post-disciplinary transgression, all these things, these challenges of boundaries, it's at my taste. But I also think it's a lead to a lot of misunderstanding to a lot of people who can't figure out very well what does it mean. It's not the meaning of being against. It's like talking about institutional critique. It's not being against an institution like the university. Without this translation, I think Einstein couldn't be the inventor of all these things. It's about moving beyond these borders, finding other possibilities of things what can be. And I refer to the West American performance artist Andrea Flecker, who's saying institution is not only a building like university or galleries or theater buildings. We are institution, person, people, through our education, our academic course, we represent a kind of institution, but which one are we representing? How do we stand in these institutions? That's what I wanted to add. Thank you very much for the presentation.
When you were talking, I was thinking I agree with you as I also disagree with you at the same time. The reason why I say I agree with you is what you're talking about reminded me of Lorraine Hansberry has a really interesting play called Le Blanc. And in it, there's this point where she talks about the fact that racism is just a mere device, right? Because it's really about power. And the device changes. So it's, in one point is racism, another is religion, and another is something else. So in some ways I agree with you in the sense that, yeah, race is the red herring and there's something else behind, which is really this question of power. And this is what matters. But at the same time, in this play, there's a monologue where it says, but even though it's a device, you cannot deny the reality of that device. And so in terms of people who have been killed as a consequence of racism, people who have died of it, whose livelihoods are non-existent as a consequence. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting place because yes, we all know that genetically we all share the same fingerprint and there's no such thing as race, so to speak. But these devices have power, or at least these devices have been used to instigate certain kinds of situations and certain circumstances. So in that sense, I'll agree and disagree. And for this reason, and in fact, when you make that point, it also made me think of, especially in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of, I remember there being critiques, especially about African immigrants when we came to Europe or the Americas, not standing with anti-racist politics in certain ways. And sometimes I couldn't understand, what were the tensions. And I think sometimes or for myself, I realized that some of it was because perhaps for some Africans, what they saw was that it was about power. And so they were just interested in identifying how they would acquire some of that power, as opposed to standing with this history of racist violence that their Caribbean colleagues or other colleagues or African-American colleagues that actually experienced as a lived experience and not something that they were just reading about. And this created this difference in approach in these, in the UK or in the USA, and the way engaging or disengaging from certain kinds of important politics, so to speak. But the second point about institutions, I'm not sure if I understood you entirely, but when you're speaking, it made me think of, I think it was Gayatri Spivak who talked about enabling violation. So this idea that our Western education is actually a loss because we lose a certain aspect of our, for want of better words, our culture or our origins, where we're coming from, but then how this same loss enables us to critique the very thing that has made us lose a certain aspect or certain, let's say, knowledges, ways of being, or what have you. This is what it made me think of, but I wasn't sure if that's what you meant when you were.
I think we are on the same page, because it's that our institutionalization as academics or researchers or all these things is intended to make us think in a way like independent thinking, like my way of thinking is not always shifted in a program, in a whole of the structure of the thinking I've been taught to think in a way. I have the possibility to think in my way, and so doing is a kind of institutional critics and positioning myself in a way I would like to think things, and so recognizing that I'm coming from somewhere. But beyond all these things, my idea of institutional critic, or being not against an institution, it's also in the meaning of finding new spaces. It can be in between spaces to discuss these problems. It can be through performance, it can be through research, it can be also through representation like you did it. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Because I was thinking that sometimes doing things radically different is allowed until it really matters. So I was thinking, so I think of when I was a student, right? You can think freely, but then when you're now a professor, it's something different. And then again, it depends on the institution, the environment, the time.
Yeah, you mentioned it. The environment is not innocent. The environment in which we are now, it's determined how, in which way you have to say what, how to say it, and it's, yeah. So it's my last thoughts.
Yes, madam.
Maybe adding to this or following up on this thought, I was wondering, how really to deal with this tension between these institutional structures or the academic system that we are part of and personal conviction. It's, you said it before, kind of relating to taking your own risk, like it's on the individual in that case. So if maybe I don't, or if I want to pursue these critical educational practices, or I want to move towards postdisciplinarity, it's my risk then, but maybe there's some other processes to move towards that. Or do you see this tend towards postdisciplinarity? Do you see it happening? Or if I don't locate myself in my discipline very solidly, then I risk maybe not being eligible for professorship or something like this, you know? So can you add to that maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a difficult one because because I was thinking that I'm finding more and more that, at least for myself, that I feel you have to be out of the system to really embody what you really believe in. But then this means denying yourself of particular things. Even something as small as simple as an affiliation, although I stole one with Zephyr. I appropriated one through like a distant relationship. But it really makes a difference. I mean, it makes a difference even something really as simple as, because I remember the last time I had no affiliation, just being in a conference and introducing yourself. And suddenly you were unhinged somehow. But I guess the question becomes what you do with this being unhinged. But I think people have so many considerations that they need to make. Right? I mean, I don't have children, and I'm not married, and so I'm not worrying about those other considerations at the same time. But also, I just think sometimes I feel, one should just start small and do this work whenever you can. But to find a way to keep it on the burner, because the other thing I found. I do remember, like, when I did my PhD, I had more voice when I started than when I left, when I was coming out. And in some ways, this scared me. Yeah.
Okay, so in case there are any further questions, maybe we'll have the last one. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the last two, after Rosella.
Or talk very interesting and agreeing with this idea of academics of the art and not so familiar because it's new. But the heart, it's a place, but it's a place of feelings, right? When you love, you also hate, and it's a very contested kind of feeling. So how do you see, the processes that you describe, contestation? Because also working across different disciplines or co-producing knowledge or bordering, it means also clashing. Or is this a contested process? Which type of, maybe there is resistance, or how does this play out?
I'm trying to understand what you...
It's so if you're an individual that for example being outside academia, it's a quite contested, not contested, but you create a contestation. You say, well, I'm staying out. This is my way of resisting it. So it's also a really performative practice. You take a position. If you are inside an individual or collective, there are other ways of finding or embracing the contestation within such a process of saying, well, we want to do things differently. But we could also occupy the university. I mean, I throw another way and say, well, okay, now we create a different space and we just occupy the building. And this is another way maybe of contesting. So I wonder, what's the space of contestation in the program or in what you're proposing?
Yeah, I think in some ways I would say then for me it's a question of what your, in some ways, what your heart can take, right? Because I do think that that there's a point where you know that you're not able to, at least for me, where you find that you find yourself disappearing and trying to have contestation in a particular way, which means staying within the institution. I don't know. I'm not making any sense right now. I think it's about knowing the breaking point in some ways, and that for some, yes, it can be through staying within. It can be through staying within and pushing the boundaries from within and having contestation from within and being able to withstand that. But I think for others, that this is not possible, that it needs to be creating a little bit of a distance. But you can still, but in some ways you still engage with some of the ideas through what you read, through who you communicate with, who you interact with, and so on and so forth. Because, and I'm thinking it's not only about academia, I think it's about any workspace that you're in. Because I'm thinking one place was particularly where I worked, and I think that's when I, for myself, had a very visceral experience of thinking from the heart, is when I woke up from sleep and I felt like a screaming no from my heart and not my head. I'd done all the calculations and the pros and cons, but it was really this no. And I sort of knew, okay, no matter what, even though in some ways I loved the colleagues I worked with, but we just were not good working together. It was really that simple. But as you were talking, the other thing I was thinking of, and for me maybe the reason why this idea of love is important is really almost like for me a form of listening and sort of understanding why the person or the person especially you're in opposition with may be coming from the position that they're in. But this does not necessarily mean that you accept it. But in certain ways, I think it changes how you interact with the individual. Or, yeah. Anyway, I'm not making sense again.
Yeah. I know you're getting tired, but this is lost. I don't think it's central to your argument, but the way that you kind of took us, you built up the argument towards kind of an invitation to pluralizing how we study and so forth. You had a section in the beginning where you were talking about different foregrounding uncertainty, rhizomatic and network thinking and so forth. And so my question would be why do you think why do you add that into your argument? And the reason why I'm asking that is because I was trained in complexity theory, which has become a new kind of grand pet narrative, grand theory, so to speak, from very much kind of nurtured in this what we call interdisciplinary science. Mm-hmm. But it comes out as something that really simplifies, although it says a lot that it's doing complexity and it foregrounds uncertainty, the open-endedness. But at the same time, there's kind of some kind of underlying structure that kind of sits within like strong institutions in the north that still kind of, they don't give it, you know, all these other things that you were talking about, they're not reading that.
Yeah.
When it comes up and it becomes packaged and it travels the world and it codifies wherever it lands in a particular form. It says openly, you know, the world is uncertain, it's open-ended, but it's still within this gesture of kind of knowing, which I sense is something that you would like to defeat, to undermine. So that's one reason, and I think it's kind of connected to that is also the scenarios. We were talking about futures and scenarios, which I also have problems with. I think one problem with the kind of what we call the colonial thinking was about prospect, about future, about, you know, mapping in the other territory. And you said that the metaphor was the tree metaphor. Today, that metaphor is network science. It's the network that is the way through which you map this new territory. That is still, so it's still a gesture from within, kind of a colonial, imperial logic. So this is why I'm wondering what took you into those, because I don't think you really need it for the kind of argument you want to do.
Yeah, I think, well, the idea was that I was presenting some of the different reasons that at the moment abound for this rethinking or unthinking. And some of them are this more sort of technocratic, practical, as a consequence of, let's say, for example, technology, from seeing the minute to the expansive, we have a different understanding of existence. And so for this reason, we must unthink science. And then, of course, there are others that are very much this more political stance. I'm thinking of decolonial scholars. So it was really to show the range of positions that are all arguing for the same thing, but for different reasons and with different intent. Yeah.
I think they start at different political.
Yes, no,
very,
very much. Yes, well, this I'll agree with you. But in certain ways, it's how can we put it? We're all in this mess together.
Yeah, but in different ways.
And so, at least for me, what is significant or useful is the fact that we're all moving somehow in the same wavelength and understanding that we need to do things differently, and perhaps this opens a space for possibilities of, as much as sometimes I don't like the term, but aligning interests somehow. Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Maybe also, I mean, you put in, it's me again. The question of body and feelings.
Yeah.
And also the question of vulnerability and violence. And of course, I think that being aware of it and saying stop, or, you know, let's do a slow academic or contemplation or just collective work or refusal, I think that are very important discussions, but you also are suggesting a political project, which is happening in different places at the moment in regard to the transformation of education in South Africa, for example, which I think is very key in order to see what does it mean, for example, in Europe when we start to have discussions about why my professor not black, where the black students of colors. So these things are happening, and it's not easy, depending where you are, it's very violent. But this collective kind of debates are happening. So I was just wondering how do you relate to that? Because it is a political project and this is an institution, and I still think that we need to be there in order to have spaces like this one and move forward.
Yeah. I have to admit that from my own personal circumstances, I've found that actually the privilege of my mobility has unanchored me from those kinds of communities, so to speak. Because when I remember at least being in the UK and being more tapped in, more clued to more engage, knowing where they perhaps are like-minded individuals trying to do something different. I found that as I've moved around, this has become somehow, it has become easier to be just solely in the ivory tower with the ideas of doing something different. But yes, I understand that, or I see or I sense that in many contexts that they are these communities of resistance in certain ways. And I'm thinking in academia, I think in many places we probably see it more in undergraduate students, for example, and some of the activism than compared to, let's say, postgraduate students. Yeah. But I think, oh yeah, also in that discussion group, and maybe you know, maybe it's just my own, but I at the same time feel as if I talked I think a little bit that they feel as if there's more of a, I don't know whether to call it a fragmentation, but also an individualization of circumstances. And I don't know, I just feel the spirit feels very different from, let's say, the 80s or 90s to this moment, that in some ways, even though there's more access to knowledge or more access to information, it seems as if it's harder to find communities to dock into or to dock onto. I don't know. I have to think about this a bit more.
Okay, great. On that note, we say a big thank you to